The phone call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Reverend Marcus Henderson sat alone in his study, the smell of old leather and communion wine still clinging to his robes from the evening service. The voice on the other end was trembling. Another pastor 50 miles away, someone he'd met exactly twice at denominational conferences. The man was crying. Not the theatrical tears of a Sunday altar call, but the raw, desperate sobbing of someone who'd been holding something in for far too long. "I can't do this anymore," the voice said, "but I can't stop either, and I don't know which terrifies me more." Marcus had received 17 similar calls in the past year. He would receive 43 more before the year ended. None of them would ever be spoken about in daylight. In the American South, where 76% of adults identify as Christian, and church attendance shapes political power, social networks, and even economic opportunities, pastors occupy a peculiar space between the sacred and the secular, between shepherds of the Spirit and managers of multi-million-dollar organizations. They stand in pulpits every Sunday morning, speaking with the authority of divine calling, their voices echoing through sanctuaries that can hold anywhere from 50 to 5,000 souls. But what happens when the lights go down? What conversations unfold in locked offices, in late-night phone calls, and secret meetings at restaurants 40 miles from home where nobody knows your face? The answer is more complex, more human, and more devastating than you might imagine. Dr. Sarah Thornton spent 7 years conducting anonymous interviews with 312 Southern pastors across 11 states. Her 2019 study, published in the Journal of Religion and Health, remains one of the few academic attempts to document what she calls the pastoral crisis of authenticity. The numbers are staggering. 61% of pastors in her study reported feeling they were living a double life. 49% said they'd seriously considered leaving ministry in the past year, but here's what stopped her cold. 83% said they were afraid, not of losing their position, not primarily of financial hardship, but of something more primal. They were afraid of the truth. The First Baptist Church of Ridgewood, Mississippi burned to the ground on a March night in 2017. The fire marshal ruled it accidental, an electrical fault in the aging wiring of the fellowship hall. But Reverend James Caldwell, who'd served that church for 19 years, knew something nobody else did. He'd been stealing from the building fund for 6 years. Not for drugs, not for gambling, not even for another woman. He'd been paying his daughter's medical bills, his daughter who suffered from a rare autoimmune disorder, whose treatments cost $14,000 a month, whose insurance had been quietly dropped by the church when the deacons decided to reallocate funds to a new parking lot. James never told anyone. When the church burned, the financial records went with it. He preached his daughter's funeral 4 months later, having sold everything he owned to pay for her final treatments. The congregation never knew that their pastor, the man who'd baptized their children and buried their dead, had committed what he considered the unforgivable sin. He lives in Kentucky now, working at a hardware store, attending a church where nobody knows his name. He hasn't spoken about his pastoral life in 7 years. But the fear isn't always about moral failure. Sometimes it's about something more subtle, more insidious. It's about belief itself. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the human stories behind the history that shapes our world. If you're finding value in what we do here, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. It helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into the untold narratives of our time. Now, before we go further, I'm curious, where are you watching this from? What time is it where you are? And here's something I genuinely want to know. What's your profession? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and your perspectives from different walks of life add so much to these conversations. The statistics are difficult to verify because, by definition, the pastors who struggle with doubt don't advertise it. But Daniel Dennett and Linda Lascola's groundbreaking 2010 study, Preachers Who Are Not Believers, interviewed clergy members who'd lost their faith but continued to serve. Their follow-up research in 2015 found that for every one pastor who admits to religious doubt, approximately 15 to 20 others privately share the same struggle but remain silent. Consider Reverend Michael Preston of Birmingham, Alabama. For 32 years, he preached the inerrant word of Scripture, led revival services, and counseled hundreds of couples through his understanding of biblical marriage. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in 2016, while preparing a sermon on the book of Genesis, something broke. Not his faith in God necessarily, but his certainty about the answers. He'd spent 3 decades speaking with absolute authority about subjects that he suddenly realized he didn't actually understand. The problem wasn't theological education. Michael held a Master of Divinity from a respected seminary. The problem was what happens when you stand in front of people week after week, year after year, expected to have answers to questions about suffering, death, meaning, and eternity, when you yourself are human, finite, and just as confused as everyone else. According to a 2023 Barna Group study, 48% of Protestant pastors in America say they've experienced depression severe enough to interfere with their daily functioning. Yet only 12% have sought professional help, and an even smaller percentage, just 7%, have disclosed their struggles to their congregations. The southern states show an even more pronounced gap. In Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, and South Carolina, the stigma against pastoral vulnerability remains so strong that admission of mental health struggles can result in immediate termination in 64% of cases, according to data from the Southern Baptist Convention's Pastoral Care Division. The fear of appearing weak, of failing to embody the strength that congregations expect, creates a pressure cooker effect. Pastors become performers, and the performance never ends. But there's another fear that haunts Southern pastorhoods, one that's become increasingly acute in the past 15 years. It's political. In Dalton, Georgia, Reverend Thomas Wright found himself in an impossible position during the 2020 election cycle. His congregation of 200 members spanned the political spectrum, but the vocal majority, approximately 68% according to his informal polling, held strong conservative views. They expected their pastor to speak clearly on political issues, to endorse candidates from the pulpit, to frame the election in spiritual terms. But Thomas had spent months studying liberation theology, reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s lesser-known sermons, wrestling with questions of justice, power, and the church's prophetic role. When he preached a sermon suggesting that Christians might disagree on political matters while maintaining unity in faith, the backlash was immediate. He received 47 angry emails within 12 hours. 3 deacons requested an emergency meeting. One family, who'd attended the church for 3 generations and contributed $80,000 annually, left the next Sunday and never returned. Thomas didn't preach about politics again. Not because he'd changed his mind, but because he'd learned what many Southern pastors learn. The congregation holds the real power, and that power can be withdrawn at any moment. The Cooperative Baptist Fellowship's 2022 survey of ministerial health found that 71% of pastors in Southern states report feeling caught between theological convictions and congregational expectations. This creates what researchers call moral injury, the psychological wound that occurs when someone is forced to act against their deepest values. It's the same phenomenon documented in combat veterans, in healthcare workers forced to ration care, in anyone placed in positions where institutional demands conflict with personal conscience. And then there's sex. Of course there's sex. The data on pastoral sexual misconduct is both incomplete and troubling. A 2018 investigation by the Fort Worth Star-Telegram identified over 700 victims of sexual abuse within Southern Baptist churches across 20 years, with 380 church leaders and volunteers convicted or charged with sex crimes. But those are just the reported cases, the ones that made it into the legal system. The actual number is certainly higher, perhaps exponentially so. But the whispered conversations among pastors aren't always about predation, though that certainly exists and must be confronted. More often, they're about the garden variety struggles of human desire operating under impossible standards. Pastors are expected to model perfect marriages, to never look with lust, to embody a sexual purity that verges on the superhuman. When they fail, as humans inevitably do, the shame is crushing. Reverend David Chen served a church in Nashville for 11 years before his wife discovered his pornography addiction. Not child pornography, nothing illegal, just the standard internet variety that millions of Americans consume regularly. But for a pastor, it was catastrophic. The elders gave him a choice: resign immediately and relocate to another state, or face a public disclosure that would destroy not just his career, but his wife's teaching position at the Christian school and his children's social standing in the community. He chose relocation. His wife chose divorce. His children, now adults, haven't spoken to him in 8 years. He works in IT now in Portland, as far from the South as he could manage. He hasn't set foot in a church since 2015. The hidden crisis isn't just individual, it's structural. According to the Duke Clergy Health Initiative's comprehensive 2021 study of 1,726 pastors, Southern clergy work an average of 56.3 hours per week, with 23% working more than 65 hours weekly. They're expected to be counselors without counseling training, financial managers without business education, public speakers without communication degrees, and spiritual guides while navigating their own doubts and struggles. The burnout rate is astronomical. 38% of pastors in the study met the clinical criteria for burnout, a rate comparable to emergency room physicians and air traffic controllers. Yet the salary doesn't match the demands. The National Association of Church Business Administration reports that the median pastoral salary in southern states is $48,000, with many rural pastors earning less than $35,000. In bivocational ministry, which now accounts for approximately 40% of Southern Baptist pastors, clergy work full-time secular jobs while serving churches that expect full-time pastoral availability. Reverend Linda Morrison, one of the few female pastors in rural Tennessee, worked as a nurse for 15 years while leading a congregation of 75 members. She'd finish a 12-hour shift at the hospital, drive directly to the church for evening Bible study, then spend her days off preparing sermons, visiting shut-ins, and managing the endless administrative details of church life. When she finally collapsed from exhaustion during a Sunday service, the congregation's response wasn't concern about her health. It was anxiety about who would preach the next week. She resigned 3 months later. The church dissolved within a year. Nobody talks about it. But perhaps the deepest fear, the one that surfaces in those late-night phone calls and secret meetings, is the fear of irrelevance. Church attendance in the American South has declined 15% since 2007, according to Pew Research Center data. Among adults under 40, the decline is even steeper, approaching 28% in some states. The religious landscape that gave Southern pastors their authority, their social standing, their very reason for existing, is shifting beneath their feet. And many of them don't know how to adapt. The Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant denomination, lost over 2 million members between 2006 and 2023. Churches are closing at a rate of approximately 70 to 80 per week across the denomination. Rural churches, in particular, are struggling. In counties with populations under 50,000, nearly 40% of churches report average Sunday attendance below 30 people. These aren't viable organizations in any conventional sense. They're communities on life support, kept alive by aging congregations and pastors who can't imagine doing anything else. Reverend Harold Webb is 73 years old. He's served the same church in rural Louisiana for 48 years. The congregation that once numbered 200 now has 17 regular attendees, all over the age of 65. The building is falling apart. The roof leaks. The air conditioning failed 3 years ago, and they can't afford to fix it. Harold preaches every Sunday to those 17 faithful souls, knowing that when he retires or dies, the church will almost certainly close forever. He doesn't talk about it. What would he say? The isolation is perhaps the cruelest aspect of pastoral life. While congregations share their struggles with their pastor, pastors have nowhere to turn. Denominational hierarchies offer little real support. Peer groups exist, but they're often performative spaces where pastors compete to demonstrate success rather than admit failure. And seeking outside help from therapists or counselors carries its own stigma. Dr. Matthew Stanford, a neuroscientist at Baylor University who specializes in the intersection of faith and mental health, has documented what he calls the pastoral loneliness epidemic. In his 2020 study of 200 Protestant clergy, 42% reported having no close personal friends. 67% said they had no one outside their immediate family with whom they could share their deepest struggles. Among Southern pastors specifically, the numbers were even more pronounced. 51% reported no close friendships, and 74% said they felt fundamentally alone. The theological irony is profound. These are people whose entire vocation centers on community, on connection, on the belief that humans are meant for relationship with God and each other. Yet they themselves exist in profound isolation, unable to be fully known or fully honest with anyone. Reverend Angela Martinez broke that pattern, though it cost her everything. After serving a church in South Carolina for 7 years, she preached a sermon in which she revealed her struggles with anxiety, her questions about prayer, her doubts about whether God really answered specific requests, or whether the universe simply unfolded according to natural law while humans created narrative meaning. She spoke about her failed first marriage, her journey through therapy, her discovery that vulnerability wasn't weakness but the foundation of authentic faith. The sermon went viral, shared thousands of times on social media, featured in Christianity Today and The Atlantic. Angela became a voice for pastoral honesty, for the possibility that religious leadership could be human and flawed and still meaningful. Her congregation fired her within 2 months. The official reason was theological drift. The real reason, as one elder told her privately, was that people didn't come to church to see their pastor's wounds. They came to have their own wounds healed. A pastor's job was to project strength, certainty, and divine authority. Angela's honesty felt like betrayal. She now leads an online community of former pastors, what she calls the exiled shepherds. There are over 4,000 members, all of them people who left or were forced out of pastoral ministry. They share stories, resources, job leads, and most importantly, they tell the truth. The things they couldn't say from the pulpit, they say there. But some fears are darker than professional anxiety or theological doubt. Some fears are about safety. In recent years, threats against clergy have increased dramatically. A 2022 study by the Religious Freedom Institute documented a 400% increase in violent threats against religious leaders between 2016 and 2021. Southern pastors, particularly those who speak on controversial issues like racial justice, immigration, or LGBTQ inclusion, report receiving death threats, vandalism, and harassment. Reverend Jonathan Ross preached a sermon in 2019 about loving your enemies, using language that some congregants interpreted as insufficiently patriotic. Within a week, his home address was posted on a white nationalist website. He received 17 death threats in 3 days. His children were harassed at school. His wife stopped leaving the house. He didn't report it to the police. He didn't want the publicity. Instead, he softened his sermons, stuck to safer topics, stopped saying the things he believed God was calling him to say. The threats stopped. So did something else. He could feel it dying inside him, the prophetic voice, the courage to speak truth to power. By the time he finally left ministry 2 years later, he'd become the kind of pastor he'd once despised. Safe, predictable, irrelevant. The question that haunts these conversations, the whispered confessions and secret meetings, is this: what is ministry actually for? Is it to comfort, to challenge, to preserve tradition, to prophesy change? Is a pastor a spiritual leader or a religious employee? A prophet or a chaplain to the status quo? The confusion isn't new. Martin Luther King Jr. addressed it in his 1963 Letter from Birmingham Jail, critiquing white moderate clergy who valued order over justice, comfort over truth. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrestled with it in Nazi Germany, ultimately deciding that faithfulness to the gospel required resistance to the church's accommodation with evil. Throughout Christian history, pastors have faced the tension between institutional loyalty and prophetic witness. But in the contemporary American South, where church and culture are so thoroughly intertwined, where Christianity is assumed rather than examined, where pastors are expected to bless the existing social order while calling people to holiness, the tension has become unbearable for many. And so they whisper. They whisper about the secret doubts, the hidden failures, the fear that they're fundamentally frauds. They whisper about the marriages that look perfect on Sunday morning but are dying in silence. They whisper about the kids who've abandoned the faith, about the theological questions they can't answer, about the crushing weight of other people's expectations. They whisper about money too. The fact that many of them are broke, drowning in seminary debt while earning less than public school teachers. The fact that churches expect them to live exemplary lives on poverty wages. The fact that when they finally burn out and leave ministry, they have no transferable skills and no retirement savings. Reverend Stephen Park left ministry in 2021 after 23 years. He'd served churches in Georgia and Alabama, preached thousands of sermons, officiated hundreds of weddings and funerals. When he resigned, citing burnout and the need to care for his mental health, the church gave him 2 weeks severance. He was 51 years old with $73,000 in student loan debt from seminary, no secular work experience, and no idea what to do next. He now delivers for DoorDash while trying to figure out his next chapter. He makes about $32,000 a year. It's more than he made as a pastor. The Southern Baptist Convention's 2023 report revealed that pastoral tenure is at an all-time low. The average pastor now stays at a church for just 3.6 years, down from 7.2 years in 1992. The reasons are complex, but they cluster around a few themes: burnout, conflict, financial stress, and what researchers call vocational disillusionment. The discovery that the actual work of ministry bears little resemblance to the calling they once felt. Yet people keep entering the ministry. Seminaries still enroll students, still graduate young men and women who believe God has called them to pastoral work. Are they naive, idealistic, or do they represent something essential, the stubborn human hope that meaning can be found in service, that communities need spiritual leadership, that the whispered fears of their predecessors won't become their own? There's a particular conversation that happens among pastors, usually late at night, usually after several drinks in cities where they're attending conferences and won't be recognized. They talk about legacy. Not the legacy they want to leave, but the legacy they fear they actually are leaving. Churches that will close within a decade of their departure, congregants who never really understood the gospel, children who saw through the performance and rejected faith entirely. Years of work that amounted to nothing more than keeping a dying institution on life support for a few more quarters. This is the fear they won't admit publicly, that it's all been for nothing. But here's what's interesting. When researchers actually study the long-term impact of pastoral ministry, the picture is more nuanced. Dr. Amy Reynolds at Duke Divinity School conducted a 20-year longitudinal study of people who'd been active in churches during their youth. She found that while institutional loyalty was declining, the impact of genuine pastoral relationships remained significant. People remembered pastors who'd shown up during crises, who'd listened without judgment, who'd embodied compassion rather than just preaching about it. The ministry that mattered wasn't the Sunday morning performance. It was the Tuesday afternoon hospital visit, the 2 a.m. phone call when someone was suicidal, the patient conversation with a teenager struggling with sexuality, the willingness to sit with someone in their doubt rather than offering cheap certainty. In other words, the aspects of ministry that pastors are least celebrated for, that generate no numerical growth or institutional success, are the things that actually matter. Reverend Grace Kim discovered this after leaving a megachurch where she'd been on staff for 8 years. The church had all the markers of success: 4,000 members, multi-million-dollar budget, television broadcasts, multiple satellite campuses. But Grace felt increasingly hollow. The work had become about metrics, about filling seats and increasing giving and producing content. The actual pastoral care, the messy work of being present to suffering and doubt and complexity, was outsourced to small group leaders and counseling referrals. She now serves a congregation of 90 people in rural North Carolina. She makes $38,000 a year. She's never been happier because, as she puts it, I finally get to do the thing I thought I was signing up for. I get to be with people, not manage them, not perform for them, just be with them. The transformation of American Christianity over the past 40 years has created this crisis. As churches have embraced business models, adopted corporate structures, and measured success in purely numerical terms, the pastoral role has shifted from spiritual guide to organizational CEO. And many pastors are discovering they never wanted to be CEOs. They wanted to help people encounter the divine, wrestle with meaning, build communities of compassion and justice. The whispered conversations often circle back to this tension. What does faithful ministry look like in an age of decline? If the era of Christendom is ending in America, if Christianity is becoming one option among many rather than the assumed cultural default, what's the pastoral calling? Some see it as a crisis, others see it as liberation. Reverend Marcus Henderson, the pastor we met at the beginning, who receives those late-night calls from struggling colleagues, has developed a kind of underground pastoral care network. He connects pastors with therapists who understand religious contexts, helps them find spiritual directors, creates spaces where they can be honest without fear of professional consequences. He calls it ministry to the ministers. When asked why he does it, why he carries the weight of other people's secrets and struggles on top of his own pastoral responsibilities, he quotes a line from Frederick Buechner. "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." The world's deep hunger, he believes, includes the hunger of pastors themselves. They need someone to pastor them, someone to receive their confessions, someone to say, "You're not alone, you're not crazy, you're not a failure, you're human, and that's okay." The institutional church hasn't figured this out yet. Denominations still operate on models that assume pastors are spiritual superheroes, always available, infinitely resilient, capable of carrying everyone else's burdens without buckling under the weight. The structures don't account for pastoral vulnerability, doubt, failure, or humanity. So the whispered conversations continue. In parking lots after denominational meetings, in encrypted signal chats, in anonymous online forums where pastors gather to say the things they can't say anywhere else. They whisper, "I don't believe in hell anymore, but I have to preach about it." They whisper, "My marriage is falling apart and I'm supposed to counsel other couples." They whisper, "I'm gay and I'm terrified." They whisper, "I have no idea if prayer actually works." They whisper, "I'm so tired, I'm just so tired." And the most tragic part is that these whispers, these confessions of humanity and struggle, are precisely the things that could make pastoral ministry more authentic, more compassionate, more real. But the system punishes honesty. It rewards performance. It creates conditions where the truth must remain hidden. There are exceptions, of course. Churches that create space for pastoral vulnerability. Denominations that prioritize clergy health over institutional growth. Communities that understand their pastor as a fellow traveler, not a spiritual guru. But they're rare, especially in the South where religion and culture are so deeply fused, where being a pastor still carries social capital and political influence, where the performance of certainty is rewarded and the admission of doubt is dangerous. The question for those of us outside the pastoral role is, what do we actually want from religious leadership? Do we want human beings with all the complexity and struggle that implies? Or do we want performers, people who will maintain the illusion of certainty and strength even when it's destroying them? Because the current model is destroying them. The statistics on pastoral burnout, depression, and attrition tell that story clearly. The whispered conversations, the late-night phone calls, the secret meetings, all of it points to a system that's fundamentally unsustainable. Yet people keep showing up. On Sunday mornings in small churches and megachurches across the South, pastors stand in pulpits and preach. Some of them are burned out. Some are doubting. Some are terrified. Some are faking it until they make it or break. But some of them, remarkably, are finding ways to be honest, to preach with humility rather than certainty, to admit they don't have all the answers, to model what it looks like to be a faithful human rather than a religious superhero. These are the whispers that deserve to become shouts. The confession that doubt and faith aren't opposites, that struggle and calling can coexist, that pastoral ministry might be more about presence than performance.